This episode of Around the Layout is brought to you by Rapido Trains.
Buying Rapido trains will make you happy.
Haven't you heard? Rapido Trains has announced a U-boat load of General Electric U-Series locomotives, U-25Bs, U-30CGs, U-33Cs, and U-36Cs, and the U-34CH. You can check out all of these new releases and much more on their website, rapidotrains.com. Did the snow keep you from getting to the Railroad Hobby Show? No worries. Spring Creek Model Trains has you covered. Right now, ATLP listeners can take 5% off in-stock, regularly priced Rapido Trains products on their website through May 31st. Use code ATLPSPRING26 at checkout at springcreekmodeltrains.com. Trains aren't just a hobby, they're a way of life. At 1810 Designs, they create handcrafted wood art that captures the spirit of the rails. Whether you're a modeler, a collector, or just love the sound of a distant whistle, 1810 Designs is here to enhance the hobby. Visit 1810designs.com and bring the railroad home. ATLP Extra is our monthly newsletter delivered right to your inbox each month. Sign up for free at atlpextra.com. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Around the Layout, where model railroaders come to tell their story. My name is Ray Arnott. So glad you could join us. On this episode, we're going to be heading to the D&H Penn Division and heading back to the 1970s. And the person that's going to take us there, coming to us from Georgia, Justin Jankauskus. Justin, glad to have you on the show.
Thanks, Ray. It's a pleasure to be here, an honor to be here.
And I hope I said your name right. It'll be par for the course if I didn't. So
no, you're good.
Been learning a lot about your D&H Penn Division in the 1970s. You got some great coverage on Facebook that we'll share in the show notes, aroundthelayout.com/222. But really looking forward to diving into this, getting to know you a bit better, learning about your model railroading journey and how it led to you modeling the D&H.
Absolutely, yeah.
So for those that don't know you, Justin, why don't you tell us kind of what you're doing in the model railroading world?
Well, I started model railroading probably in, I would say, late elementary school, early middle school. So I was kind of late to the party. I grew up in northeastern Pennsylvania, Carbondale, Pennsylvania, which was a main hub for the Delaware and Hudson. At the time, beyond having a Lionel around the Christmas tree, really wasn't into model railroading per se. But growing up in that area, there's basically three things that you would be employed by, and that would be either in the industries, in a factory somewhere, in the coal mines, or on the railroad. And my family was employed in the coal mines. My grandfather and my father were both heavy equipment operators in the strip mines in the area up there. And the coal mines and the railroads kind of intertwined. If you lived in that area, you knew one and the other just because they're everywhere. And so my interest was kind of peaked in the coal mining. My grandfather used to take me up there and let me climb over all the heavy equipment and stuff. And the railroads were just always in the area. I didn't know what I was looking at, but I knew what was there. So the D&H was, it was the main yard in Carbondale was really greatly downgraded by that time. So you might see a local here and there coming in to serve a couple local industries. But again, I really didn't know what I was looking at. So probably mid-'80s, they abandoned the Penn Division just because of the severity of the grades. And it was just an expensive railroad to maintain, pusher service. So that you had a lot of extra manpower that was required to move trains across it. And they took over the line from Conrail straight from Scranton right into Binghamton, New York, which was the nail in the coffin. So I don't remember as a kid mainline railroading per se on the Penn Division. That was all gone. That was all being routed over the old DL&W at that point. But, again, it was everywhere. You could go down to Scranton, you could see locomotives, that blue and gray lightning stripe scheme was, I didn't know what I was looking at, but, you could tell it was a D&H locomotive. So that was kind of how it all started for me with the Delaware and Hudson.
So you mentioned that you, as a youth, were not particularly all that interested in model railroading. When did the model railroading first start to garner interest?
I was probably, I would say maybe about fifth grade or so, maybe 10, 12 years old. And I don't remember what specifically started it, but I do remember when we first moved to Georgia, I had a 4x8 and we lived in a duplex, and the upstairs it was all one big room, and it was my room. That was my room. And it was a big room, had a big closet and my own bathroom. And I had a 4x8 sheet of plywood with a train running on it. And I don't specifically remember how I got it, why I got it, but my parents used to take me to all the local hobby shops, and it was probably just like a Model Power or a Lifelike or something like that. But I had a loop of track, running around that 4x8, but I didn't have space to build anything. And I really didn't know anything about model railroading at that point. And it wasn't until later when I started going to hobby shops and looking at model railroaders and magazines and different videos that I really started to realize, I guess, that, wow, this is a little bit more than beyond a circle of track. There's people out there that are doing stuff that's really cool. And I think I would like to do that as well.
So you're seeing this influence coming from the magazines. Do you recall anything in particular from those magazines that really stuck in your mind?
I remember seeing a scenery book by Dave Frary, and I believe it was a narrow gauge railroad that he had a scenery book about. And I'm talking, dyed sawdust, lichen bushes. I mean, this was cutting edge at the time, right? And I remember looking at that and thinking, oh, wow, that's cool. That's more than just, green paint on a sheet of plywood with a track running through it. That's something that I want to try to do.
So would you say that the scenery maybe brought you in a little bit more than the railroad? I mean, that kind of sticks in your mind as something to remember, seeing Dave Frary's work.
100%. And I'm even that way to today. That's my thing, is scenery. That's what I love to do. Building the bench work is, I mean, I enjoyed that part of it. Laying track, I despise. Electrical, I despise. But the scenery part, and now that I'm, a little bit further along with my layout, I'm into the operations, but it's kind of, having that train going through a scene or working in industry that, I detailed the yard inside that industry, or, there's trash between the rails, and, I'm immersing myself in that as I'm operating. That's still what I enjoy today.
So you mentioned at 10 or 12 years old, you started with a 4x8 layout. What was the next step from there? Did you take that influence and start applying it to the 4x8, or did you start to make some changes?
We moved, and the house that we moved into, we were renting, but it was like a split level. So it had a lower level that was largely unfinished besides a laundry room. So that 4x8 got moved into there, and we added another sheet to it. So now it's an 8x8. And it was a disaster. I mean, track work was terrible. You couldn't reach the center of that thing with a 10-foot pole, it seemed like, if you wanted to, if you had a problem in the middle of it. I mean, an 8x8 layout is enormous, right?
Right.
And, looking at, again, I'm learning as I'm going. I'm looking at, magazines, videos, and I'm like, this, I'm getting somewhere, but it's not where, this isn't right. Something's not right here. And that's when I realized that, okay, I'm seeing these things. There's a flow to it. There's, it's not just a huge mass of lumber. So that whole thing came down, and we trashed the whole thing. And I built in the same space, like a U-shaped around the walls that was a little bit more manageable. But at that point, we were moving again. We actually bought a house, and that's the house that my dad still lives in today. But so that layout, the U-shaped layout, really didn't make it much further beyond bench work and some track work. So I still haven't really gotten to that point yet where I'm able to start doing some scenery, really, to really dive into that. So we fast forward into my dad's house now. It's a 3-bedroom, 2-bath ranch on a slab. So there's not really a place for a model railroad other than a spare bedroom. And, my mom wasn't going to let me do that. So I went to the attic and started building up there what was going to be like a quote unquote real model railroad. So I start building up there, got bench work done, got track work done, started in on some scenery. I'm making puffball trees. I'm setting them on the mountain. I'm okay, this is looking good. This is looking more like what I'm seeing in some of these publications. But you got to keep in mind, I'm in an attic in Georgia. So in July, when it's 100 degrees outside, it's probably 175 in that attic. So, in the summertime, I'd have to take all my locomotives out of there. My buildings, the glue would be, crumbling and popping apart. And then in the wintertime, when it's 30 degrees outside, it's 30 degrees in that attic. So my window of working on it was very, very small. And so now I'm getting into like 8th grade, freshman in high school. I'm playing football, sports, the frustration of the space that I had, it just kind of killed the whole thing for me at that point. So I kind of just dropped the hobby for a while. All that stuff was sitting up in my dad's attic. And going into college, I gathered it all up, sold it online, sold it in a couple swap meets, got rid of everything basically for beer money to go to college, and was essentially out of the hobby at that point.
Later on, we're going to learn that the father-son relationship surrounding model railroading is very important to you. But what was it like between you and your dad? I mean, obviously he was supporting it with some space and perhaps some materials. How was that? How was your dad with the model railroading hobby?
My dad was very supportive, as in he was a home builder by trade. So he was good with the carpentry. He helped me with that end of it. My dad struggles to draw a stick figure. So he has no artistic in him at all. I get all that from my mother. My mother actually would come periodically in the fall. She would climb up the pull down attic steps to come up there, and she would tinker with some stuff with me just because she enjoyed, the art aspect of it. But, they both, they hauled me all over Metro Atlanta to different train shows and hobby shops and stuff like that. So they were both very supportive in that respect.
Yeah, we know, for youth and model railroading, a huge support system really starts at home, and that support, it's great to have. Even if the parents aren't into it, at least making sure that the kids are into it. And it sounds like your parents both were very much a big support system for you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome stuff. So college, and you mentioned you're spending train money as beer money and getting an education and all that. Do you remember what got the flywheel turning again for model railroading for you?
I absolutely do. So as I mentioned, I sold everything, got out of college. My wife and I got married. We bought our first house. And again, it was a 3-bedroom, 2-bath on a ranch. So I really had no space for a model railroad, but I wasn't in the hobby at that point either. I wasn't even on my radar. So, working and, young couple, we just didn't really, I was hunting and fishing. That was kind of my thing. And, I had a bass boat and I'm on the lake every weekend. So I had, different interests. So we sold that first house and we bought the house that we're currently in, and it had a full basement. Now, again, I'm not back in the hobby. So I built a bar, I built a pool room, I built a big TV entertainment area with a gun cabinet with all my guns and my taxidermy, and we would have my buddies over, we'd play cards. So it was just a whole different vibe down there. And it was, I was going through some boxes and I found a Atlas yellow box D&H RS11. Of all the stuff I sold, for some reason, I kept that. I don't know why. I guess, sentimental value from, it being a D&H unit. But I found that locomotive that I had kept, the one piece that I did keep. And I thought, you know what? I've got this room in the basement that's, it's about a 10 by 12, unfinished. We just had some stuff stored in there. So I might try to build another model railroad, just something small in that room that I can go in there myself and tinker with. And it doesn't have to be super complex. It could be, just around the wall and a little bit of switching. And I started to look back at a lot of the periodicals and stuff that I used to look at. And I realized, wow, this has come a long way since last time I did this. And there's so much cool stuff out there. And then I start looking at different structures and locomotives and rolling stock. And I'm thinking, well, I had that, I sold it. I had that, I sold it. I had that, and I sold it. And I'm thinking, oh man, this is going to be bad. So I start building that, in that room, a Delaware and Hudson based model railroad. It wasn't exactly prototypical at that point. I was just trying to build something to get some track in there and get a few trains running, but I did want to base it on the Delaware and Hudson. So I started on that, and I decided I was going to try to squeeze a peninsula in there. And like any real, what I'm still considering myself a beginner model railroad, because this is my first attempt at a serious build, I was trying to do too much in too little of a space. I said I was going to keep it simple, but that went out the window pretty quick. And my track work, it wasn't bad, but it wasn't good either. And I started to get frustration. I'm trying to run 6-axle, C628s on a radius that's just not going to work. And I'm getting frustrated with that. So I'm trying to rebuild things to make it work. And it just, I was pleased with it. The scenery was coming out well. It was looking more like what I want it to look like, but my basics, I think I was lacking in when I started back into it. So there was a lot of stuff that I realized that I needed to work on if I'm going to have a layout that is going to be something that I'm going to be proud of and able to come down here and operate on and have other people come down here and operate on without getting frustrated every time I do it.
I still think it's pretty fascinating how model railroading will wait for you and how it lies dormant, but yet still there, right? It just waits for you and it waits for that point of life, and kind of it's a good suggestion for perhaps those listening to understand that the seasons of life, it will wait for you. And it took a seasons of life and finally a spark reignited, but at the right time, when you had the right home, when you had the time, when you had it reignited that passion.
Yeah, 100%. Yep, I agree.
So you talked about trying to build your skills. Talk about that process and learning about the hobby. What ways did you go about trying to build better track laying skills, or even starting to look at this and say, I know what I want to accomplish, or I have a better idea, and then starting to lay a game plan down for that?
That's an easy question. So there's a group of guys that are part of my operating group currently. And I equate them probably a lot to like you and Mark Herrick and the group that you guys have up there. We're friends first and we're model railroaders second. And I got in with those guys, with one of them, and they invited me to come to one of the sessions. And they had an opening. So they kind of did they had like a little informal where I had to go to each one of their houses to see their layouts. And then they all came to mine one time. And if they agreed that I, blended, I fit in with the group, that they would let me join to be a regular member. And they did. And the first night they were at my house, they came in, they saw what I was doing. They liked it. But keep in mind, I mean, this is in a 10 by 12 room. So you're only going to get 2, maybe 3 of us in there at one time. And someone else is going to have to be, doing something else outside of the room. So they start pulling tape measures and looking at load bearing walls. And I'm like, oh boy, okay, here we go. Right. So, but at the same time, I had been to all these guys' houses, and some of them are, they have smaller, logging railroads up to basement Empire, 2,500 square foot, double deck mainline layouts. And, it was cool to see just, each one of them has a specific skill set that they're really, really, really good at. And it all kind of meshed together. And I realized at that point, okay, there's a lot of things here that I'm lacking that I would like in a model railroad to do what these guys are doing as far as operations. I wasn't really operation or focused at when I started that first layout, but then I start seeing that and I thought, well, if I'm going to be in this group, I'm going to need something that we're going to all be able to operate on and enjoy. So I did. I tossed a stick of dynamite in that room, and that layout was gone. And I started framing up doorways and knocking out doorways and framing up walls and expanded my space. That was 2017. Expanded my space to the current space I have. So right now I have the original 10 by 12 room, but then I also have a 10 by 20 that is right next to it, that the whole layout is in now. But those guys were instrumental. The D&H Penn Division would not be what it is today without them. At that point, I had never wired a tortoise switch machine. I'd never hooked up a toggle with a LED for direction. I never hooked up a PM42 circuit breaker. I had no clue about any of this stuff. And they came in and just knocked it out. Like my wife was pregnant with Easton, and they came in probably 5 or 6 Fridays in a row and just knocked out bench work to where I could get to the point where I just had a sub-road bed and I could start laying track by myself. And underneath there, putting in all the drop feeders, running bus wires, hooking up and mounting tortoise machines. They were animals, and they got the entire thing to that point for me before Easton was born. And then I would take him down there in his baby carrier and set him up on the layout while I was laying track. And so those guys were instrumental in not only the construction of my layout, but me learning other aspects.
Well, how awesome to be able to find guys that know what they're doing and be able to share that with you. How did you find these folks again?
I had just met up with one of them that was in the group, and he kind of explained what they did, and just let me know that they had an opening, and if I wanted to kind of come and join them one Friday. And prior to COVID, we used to meet every Friday night at somebody else's house, and then shut that down during COVID. And now we've gone back to it, but we do it like twice a month now. So, but yeah, that was, just dumb luck, really.
How'd you meet the first guy in the first place? Because that's where it all starts.
Yeah, I think it was I had met him at a train show, and he had invited me to one of the members' house that week that they were going to be at working at that house. And I went with them and, just kind of met everybody and just kind of stood on the sidelines a little bit. But, then I went to another week's session at somebody else's house. And then, that we all kind of realized that, this is a good group of guys, and, I think I can hang out with them. And they thought the same of me, I guess. So.
Yeah, the rewards of sticking your head out there a little bit, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah, awesome. So now you've got a great start, and of course Easton comes along, and now I'm sure you've got plans now that you've got a son to share this with, and we'll get into that a little bit later. But you have this bench work, but talk about your plan to what to put on this bench work. You had mentioned earlier that you had a base idea of the Delaware and Hudson, but that railroad had long since departed when you were in that area. When do you start to learn more about the D&H, and how did you go about that process?
Well, the new layout, I knew 100% I want it to be D&H, and I wanted it to be in the late 70s post Conrail, because the Delaware and Hudson gained a lot of motive power, ex Lehigh Valley, ex Reading. It was a hodgepodge of paint schemes and patch outs. They slapped some masking tape 7s on the sides of the locomotives and to change the numbers and put them right back into service. So it was a very cool time. The Delaware and Hudson doubled in trackage pretty much overnight with the formation of Conrail. So I definitely wanted to model that era for that reason. And from the first iteration to the second, I learned that I wanted a couple things. One of them was staging. If I was going to do any kind of operation, I wanted to have some sort of staging, have a place where the trains came from and went to, and I had zero of that. It was literally, again, almost a 4x8 running around in a circle. It was a little bit more complex than that, but not much. So I definitely wanted it to have a purpose. I know you guys always say on the podcast, it's beautiful layout, but what does it do? Well, my old layout didn't do anything. So I wanted a layout that did. So I definitely wanted staging to expand the operational opportunities of it. But I also wanted the layout to be a rail fan layout where you could stand in a scene, take a shot of a locomotive, either going through a countryside. I mean, yeah, the Scranton area was very industrious and coal mining and gritty. But when you got north of Carbondale, it was nothing but just beautiful mountains and farmland. And I mean, just really out in the middle of nowhere. And I wanted to have a section of that complemented the industrial, grimy area of Scranton. So I wanted it to be a rail fanning layout where there would be a lot of opportunities to photograph trains and different types of scenes, whether it's going through an old mine refuse area of an old coal mine or the countryside up in, getting close to the New York State border. So that was one of my goals as well, to really focus on negative space and not having track work everywhere, which takes a lot of discipline, but it's well worth the effort. If you could talk yourself into doing that, take out that extra siding, leave a field or a parking lot or something that's a little, just ordinary and not, something that's, you have to squeeze a piece of track into.
Where are you learning about the scenes that you want to make composition out of on your layout?
One of my biggest influences was probably Neil Schofield, seeing a lot of his work. Then I took a trip one year to Springfield for the show, got the opportunity to go out there to his layout and see it firsthand. And it, just everything that I had seen online, I mean, it was seeing it in person just blew me away. Became good friends with Neil. And then every year since then, when I come up to Springfield, Friday night, that's where we're at, is Neil's house. And just a great guy, a humble modeler, and would tell you whatever you needed to know. So even to this day, we'll text each other, 2-3 times a week, something he's working on, something I'm working on. And, people like that I could bounce ideas off of, that I know are going to give me honest feedback, and that I respect their opinion and know that what they're going to tell me is what I'm looking to do ultimately. But his scenes of trains going through just, a single track through scenery really inspired me to really pull the reins in on the track work design and just make it look like what it would look like in real life out there. Just a field, a fence, and a main line. And it's amazing how, the old saying, less is more. It's 100% true when it comes to model railroading.
Well, I certainly agree that you have a phenomenal mentor in Neil Schofield. I've seen Neil's layout. Of course, he's been here on the podcast, and we'll share links back to his interview on our show notes, aroundthelayout.com/222. Neil is a master of scene composition and telling a story through that composition. You have that absolute feel that you are in Vermont when you go to Neil's layout and you look at these scenes. Tell me how you've been able to do that with your layout, bringing people to Pennsylvania on your layout.
Well, I wanted to try to model what I remembered as a kid. So in Carbondale, there was a breaker that was long gone, a coal breaker that was long gone when I was a kid, but the powerhouse was still there. And it was there until probably the mid-2000s before they actually tore that down. But when I remember it as a kid, a scrap dealer had taken over the property and filled that power plant's property with any kind of junk car, bus, truck, anything you can imagine. And I remember, just going down there and going through that stuff until they would run us out of there. But that was still there. The roundhouse was still there. That's gone now too. There was a 41 stall roundhouse in Carbondale. The bridge, the viaduct bridge that took the road over the throat of the yard because there was so much train traffic they couldn't have a grade crossing there. I remember going over that as a kid in the car, and it was like a metal grate for the deck, and it made this weird sound when you went over it with the tires went over it. And I remember that vividly as a kid. So I wanted to try to recreate those type things on the railroad. A pile of mine refuse, a column pile over here. I remember climbing up and down those things as a kid, and the birch trees that would grow out of the middle of them. Like I said before, my grandfather, he used to take me as a kid up into the strip mines that had been abandoned at this point, but a lot of times that was before reclamation laws were really in effect. So they just basically parked everything at the end of the shift and left it all there to rust. The pits were still open, and he would take me up there and we'd climb all over the equipment. And then, probably mid 80s, they really start, cracking down on that. And they came in and start filling the pits back in and scrapping all the equipment stuff that was out there. But I wanted to model. That's why I have scenes on my railroad that are, there'll be a spur that comes into like the power plant scene. The power plant's abandoned. It's got busted out windows. The spur is all overgrown. So I don't ever use it. I might park some maintenance away equipment on it occasionally, but it's not like I'm going to switch coal cars in and out of there. It takes a lot of discipline to build something like that because it's probably a 12-inch by, 4-foot long scene that's not really used in the model railroad. It's just a scene, but it really conveys the feel of what Carbondale looked like in that time. That the railroad was diminishing, and they were finding another route. The writing was on the wall for the Penn Division, so everybody knew that the rail traffic was going to be gone, and that's how the infrastructure looked when I was a kid. That's what I remembered, and that's what I was trying to convey when I built this version of the layout.
Did you find yourself going back and doing a lot of studying on the D&H and trying to find old photographs? And what was that process like?
Yeah, I definitely did. The book by Dominic Bourgois, the Delaware and Hudson, the South End, that he published was like the Bible for me when I built this railroad. A lot of great pictures, a lot of good information. But yes, I had to be selective of what I was going to actually include in the railroad. I didn't have the space to do a lot, and I didn't want to do a lot. I didn't want to try to cram things in there. I actually omitted a few extra things that I originally had on the plan. But yeah, the research part, and I enjoy that part of the hobby as well, is trying to figure out what they were doing, why they were doing it. There's basically a transload that was in the Carbondale yard. There was a company in Carbondale called Pizza Crust, and they made shells for pizza, like frozen pre-made shells. They made them for restaurants, or you could buy them yourself there. My grandfather actually worked in that plant, and they had a spot in the Carbondale yard that they would set out a boxcar of bagged flour, and they would come down from the plant with the truck and back it right up to the boxcar and offload the flour onto the truck and then truck it up to the plant. And it might take them a day or two to get that boxcar unloaded, but that was the type of railroading that was going on in that late 70s period. There wasn't, the heavy industry was gone, the coal mining was gone, but they were just using what was left of the infrastructure to service a couple of remaining customers. And I wanted to try to replicate those type scenarios as well in the operations of the railroad.
On your layout, what would you say is your most prototypical scene that you have?
I would say the most prototypical scene is the Vine Street branch, which was a later addition after the main room was, for the most part, completed. When I designed the railroad, I ran a branch line to the wall out of Greenridge Yard, which is just as the prototype did. And that Vine Street branch on the prototype ran into downtown Scranton, and it went through a couple of residential blocks, and then it came out into downtown Scranton, where there were some industries there. There was a big bookbinder that was a big customer, took in a lot of newsprint paper, rolled paper. There was a couple of other smaller industries, and it terminated in the Wyoming Avenue Yard. And the Delaware and Hudson Freight Station, the freight house, which is still there today, and it's the actual building that the Walthers, I believe it's the Water Street Freight Terminal. It's what that model was modeled after, and that freight house is still there in Scranton. So it was kind of an afterthought, but I always wanted to add that branch to the railroad. Once we started operating, I figured we could get a crew to take the local down that branch. It would get them out of the main room, and they could spend the entire night out there working the customers on the branch. And it would just kind of spread us out a little bit, give us a little bit more elbow room. And, it's actually, they fight over who's going to run the Vine Street branch when we do an operating session. I didn't want to make it complicated where people get frustrated. I've got plenty of runarounds, plenty of opportunities to manage your cars, but I wanted it to be interesting, and I want it to be, have a lot of different switching opportunities. So you could go out there and spend an entire evening, an entire session, 2.5 hours out there switching all those industries on the branch without getting, flustered. So I designed it specifically like that. But the track plan pretty much emulates what was there in the late 70s as far as industries and track layout. So I would say that those were that's probably my most prototypical area. I tried to scratch build a lot of the industries there based on any information that I could find. I did a lot of research prior to that because a lot of those buildings are gone now. So I really tried to emulate what was there in that late 70s time period.
In the process of learning, and of course your own family history with the railroad and your grandfather, and that's a must-have scene, right? When you know that your grandfather had done these type things, that they went and unloaded from a boxcar into a truck and brought flour up to the plant. That's a must-have. Were there things that you were unable to include in the layout that were kind of the painful let go of the model railroad process?
Yeah, there were a couple things. There was a diesel engine house in the Carbondale yard that's still there today. If you look on Google Maps, it's the shop for a scrap dealer currently now in the old Carbondale yards. I wanted to include that. It wasn't going to work. I had my friend that's in our group. I basically drew the thing out on a napkin of what I wanted. I had it in my mind what I wanted to do on the railroad. And I let him put it into a program just to make sure that everything was going to work in the space that I had. I didn't want to run into that, too tight radius type stuff again. So he did that, and we determined that, it'll work, but if you took this out, it's going to be better. So I had to admit that. There was a plastics company just outside of Carbondale that was a big customer. It was probably a 150, 200 car a year customer for the Delaware and Hudson. They made a plastic film that went into diapers. And I really wanted to try to include that. But again, I could have, but I have a nice little hillside there with some trees that, it just really kind of sets the scene. I could have knocked that out and put a couple spur tracks in there, but I decided to omit that. So it was difficult to, to try to edit, what was there to make it a little bit more realistic. But, I think it was worth the effort in the end.
It sounds to me like less is more, or that negative space is a big part of your model railroading theory.
Yeah, it is. And, I try to emulate I use black tile grout to emulate that just dark dirt color, shale color that was predominant up there in the coal mines. I really wanted to have that gritty look to it. But, if you've got, tracks everywhere, that's kind of hard to do. So, omitting something and adding just a open field or an abandoned mine area with, a couple piles of coal refuse there, I think really sets the scene a little bit more than trying to squeeze stuff in that really just doesn't belong.
I'm pretty impressed by the fact that from your adulthood, you've really only had one kind of false start layout before really diving into this. And I know you're getting by with some help from your friends and those that have been able to dive in. And of course, having, the phone a friend with Neil Schofield is definitely an advantage. And it seems to me that you're a person who's not afraid to stick their neck out and ask questions and connect and build community. And I know even this past weekend, in fact, today, the day we're recording, you came back from the Central Georgia RPM, and I'm sure there's a lot of information coming back from the Central Georgia RPM that's going to help keep that flywheel turning. But talk about this learning curve, because it seems like it went pretty quick for you, but there had to be some things that you were learning and making mistakes along the way. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I feel like I'm a relatively artistic person. I get that from my mother. So I guess scene composition kind of comes naturally to me. I have an eye for what I think looks right. And then executing it, I think it comes a little bit easier to me. I can kind of visualize it before I do it. But I think one of the biggest things, though, Ray, is just don't be afraid to try stuff. You could read about it, you could look it up online, you could watch YouTube videos on it, but and until the paintbrush hits the layout, you're not gonna learn how to do it, how not to do it. You just got to do it. So I think that's the biggest thing. If if you mess it up, you know what? You can get a scraper out and scrape it down and repaint it or re-static grass it, or, you know, pull all your super trees out and do something different. It's not permanent. So the biggest thing I think is just do it. You know, just get out there and do it. I'm not afraid just to try something. If I see something or learn something new, whether it's weathering a weathering technique on a locomotive or something, I'll just do it. You know, I mean, I watched Butch Eiler smear black paint all over a brand new locomotive, and then go back in and take it all back off and only leave it in certain areas. I mean, you know, my heart was racing when I was watching him do this. But then, you know, when he was done, I was like, oh my God, that's amazing, right? So, you know, would you ever have the courage just to, you know, out of the blue, just smear black paint all over your locomotive? No, but I know if Butch can do it and it could look good, let me try it. And I did. And, you know, I mean, it works out. So, I mean, I think the biggest thing is just to try stuff. And, you know, if it doesn't work out the first time, you know, try it again. You know, it's not, you're not going to kill anybody. Nobody's going to get hurt. It's just you're going to learn. And that's one of the biggest things I think that I've done over the probably 8-9 years that I've been building this layout.
Is there something in the model railroading hobby you wish you were better at?
I do. I wish I was better at the electronics end of things. I've tried to put in DCC decoders. I'm thinking, you know, this it can't be that hard. You know, it's you know, a few wires, a few LEDs. It can't be that hard. And I will booger it up every single time and get frustrated and want to throw the model against the wall. And then the next time I do it, I say, you know what, I'm just going to pay somebody to do it. But, you know, really, it can't be that hard. I mean, it's only a few wires, a couple LEDs. Let me try it, and I'll booger it all up again, and I get frustrated. And I think that, you know, that's probably, I wish I could do that better. You know, I'm okay with sticking a 9-pin plug in a socket, but when it comes to hardwiring and doing LEDs and all that intricate lighting that's on locomotives nowadays, I try to avoid that like the plague.
What would you say is your favorite part of the D&H Penn Division?
At this point, it's operations. You know, a railroad is never done, but I'm comfortable to say that, you know, for the most part, my entire layout is at least first pass completed. I've gone second pass on a lot of places. And at this point, I'm not so much focused on building and scenery and modeling and stuff like that. I'm really focused on operations. We've instituted a dispatcher's position recently, and I built what I'm calling a poor man's CTC panel. It's just a magnetic board, but I did run some toggle switches to my turnouts on the main line in parallel with my local panels, where we could have a dispatcher at that CTC machine controlling all the mainline turnouts. So we've been trying to incorporate that into our operations scheme, which is evolving still. But I'm at the point now where, you know, when the guys come over, we're beyond the work sessions on Friday nights. We're operating when they come to my house, and we've really been trying to hone that in with, you know, specific D&H trains that ran and where they ran to and why they ran and what kind of cargo they had on those trains. So that's kind of where I'm at now as far as you know, the enjoyment of the hobby is actually seeing it come to life.
Well, hey, we got to hear Dad's take on the layout, but I think it's time to hear the expert's take on the D&H Penn Division layout. And we're going to talk to Easton. Easton, how you doing?
Good.
Good to hear from you, buddy. Good to see you. Welcome to the show. Tell me, what's your favorite part of the layout?
Running trains.
Do you have a favorite locomotive on the layout?
My Union Pacific locomotive.
Tell me about your favorite locomotive.
I like how it's weathered.
Cool. Who weathered it?
My dad.
Awesome. When Dad's working on the layout, what are some of the things that you get to help with?
Running the industries.
Awesome stuff. So you like operating, you have your favorite locomotive. Let me ask you one more question. When you're grown up, what's your layout going to look like?
Freelanced.
It's going to be freelanced? Completely freelanced?
Mm-hmm.
Do you have a name for it yet?
Jackson County Railroad.
The Jackson County Railroad. Well, you heard it here first. Easton's Railroad is going to be awesome, I'm sure. And I can't wait to have him on around the layout to hear about that in the years to come. Easton, thank you so much for joining us.
Well,
Well, Justin, it must just make it all that much more enjoyable to be able to share this with your son. And obviously we can hear his enjoyment and passion. He has a lot of fun with your layout. And do you even call it your layout or is it our layout?
Oh, it's 100% our layout. Oh yeah.
Talk about sharing it with him. That's just got to be an absolute blast.
Yeah, he's said, like I said before, he's been in there with me since he was in a baby carrier up on the plywood bench work. But I've always kind of approached it with, never told him, no, don't touch that. He was always curious about it, but he developed a respect for it, that he knows that those aren't his Thomas trains that he could just smash together, even from when he was little, 2 years old. And it's amazing for me to see now, with him being he just turned 8. He is probably one of the better operators in our group of, anywhere from, 45 to 80-year-old men. He will run a train at 5-10 miles an hour, prototypical speed. He could make those couplers kiss when he comes into the yard. It's amazing, really, to see him running. We were at my friend's layout the other night, and he had his radio clipped to the collar of his shirt, and he had his clipboard and his throttle in one hand, and he just took out of the crew lounge, and I didn't see him for the rest of the night. I would just hear him calling back to the dispatcher on his radio, and he did amazing. So all the guys that are in the group, they're fantastic with him. They make him really feel like he's one of the guys. And, they all trust him with his equipment because they know that, he's been doing this since he was, not able to walk, and he's not gonna jeopardize any of their equipment. He's going to run it the way it should be run. So it's really fun to see that.
Talk about incorporating him into layout. I mean, you talked about your layout being pretty much done, but are there ways that you can help or get him involved with some other aspects of it, like scenery or any other types of things on the layout? Is there stuff that he's interested in doing?
Well, the big breaking news, Ray, is that we have a workout room right across the hall from my layout that is now being turned into his own HO scale layout. We started,
nice.
We started with a little 3x4 sheet of foam that he had some in-scale stuff on. And I don't know, maybe that was my fault. He was getting frustrated with the in-scale, just, trying to keep it running, and, just, it wasn't working out for him. But, he has my layout. I don't even, he could just go down there and he knows how to turn it on. He knows how to dial up locomotives on the DCC system, and he just runs. I don't even have to be down there with him. But he wants something of his own. So we're gonna build a little around the wall kind of shelf layout, give him some switching opportunities of his own in there, and let him do his freelance thing that he likes to talk about.
Well, that's awesome. And now is he helping with that track plan as well? I'm sure he's got ideas. I mean, he's doing all this operating. He's got to have ideas.
Oh yeah, he's got ideas. So we've got the bench work pretty much done. I'm going to start pulling some wiring for him. And then we're going to lay some plywood down and start laying out some track. But yeah, he already knows what he wants to do. He told me his main industry is going to be ilmenite iron ore, like the D&H ran out of New York. So that's going to be his main industry.
Oh, nice. Awesome stuff. I say that the hobby is so much better shared, and it's got to be even more better shared when it's with your son or your children or your spouse or your father or anybody. Your mother that you got to be able to share the layout with, and, being able to do some scenery with her in your younger days. And it's just amazing when there's a family connection along with it as well. So Justin, want to thank you so much for coming on Around the Layout and telling us about the D&H Penn Division. And of course, that relationship with your son and the amazing stuff that you guys are accomplishing in the basement down there in Georgia. I can't wait to get you back on the podcast. We're going to talk more about the operations. We'll make sure Don's included in on that conversation. But until the next time we meet, thank you again for coming by and sharing your story.
Thank you, Ray. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Around the Layout. Learn more about today's episode, check out past shows, and much more on our website, aroundthelayout.com. Show your support by becoming an operating crew member at aroundthelayout.com/crew. Follow us on social media, aroundthelayout.com/social. and send us your feedback around the layout at gmail.com. Thanks for hanging out with us around the layout.